Break the silence. End the violence. You're watching Voices of Victory, a TV program designed to raise awareness on domestic violence. I'm your host, and my name is Danette Mahabeer-Turner, a domestic violence survivor, advocate, and published author of a book titled Leave Alive, subtitled Goodbye Domestic Violence. And today I'm wearing purple. Purple is a symbol of peace, courage, survival, honor, and personal dedication to domestic violence awareness. Today we have an amazing episode lined up for you. But of course, my guest needs no introduction. This is our Division I McCracken County Circuit Court Judge, Judge Joe Rourk. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you for your time today. And before we get into all the judicial stuff, tell us a little bit about your background as an attorney previously.
Well, before I was elected McCracken Circuit Court Judge in 2022, I practiced family law with the Bryant Law Center for about 13 years, handled all types of cases involving every aspect of family law from divorce, custody, child support, and certainly encountered my fair share of issues involving, unfortunately, domestic violence. Before that, I was a high school history teacher for 4 years. I went to Center College in Danville, Kentucky. That's where I met my wife, Emily. She's the partner at the Bryant Law Center now, and we together have one son, Ethan James.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing. Well, as a McCracken County Circuit Court Judge, can you explain the legal definitions and clarifications of domestic violence within your jurisdiction?
Sure. Within the circuit court, typically where you encounter situations involving domestic violence is where someone, a perpetrator, an alleged perpetrator of domestic violence, has been accused criminally. It isn't a family court where Judge Henschel or a family court judge would handle situations involving, say, a protective order or an emergency protective order like that. So when we encounter situations involving domestic violence in circuit court, it's typically because the situation has gotten so dire that an individual has been charged criminally with domestic violence or some domestic violence associated crime, and they're facing criminal consequences as a result of it. And then as that case would proceed out, we'd hear the facts, and it ultimately could proceed all the way to a jury trial or be resolved by agreement with the defense attorney and the Commonwealth's attorney, the prosecutors in the case reaching what they believe to be an appropriate resolution of the case, almost always involving, if there is a conviction, some sort of no contact or protective order in place or protective provision in place where the perpetrator of the domestic violence would not be permitted to have contact with the victim of the domestic violence.
Thank you so much for sharing. And as you mentioned that, I personally, again, as a domestic violence survivor, I've experienced like orders of protection. So I had an order of protection. It was violated by the abuser, the perpetrator. Is there anything in place for like criminal charges for that? Or is it, because I know you can, get an extension for 5 years, which is what I got, and then 10 years also an option. But what is going to stop that perpetrator from breaking those legal documents?
Sure. Well, if you have a emergency order of protection or domestic violence order or an interpersonal protective order, they're all essentially the same thing. It's an order that allows a victim of domestic violence to be protected from and to be an order permitting the perpetrator of domestic violence to not have any contact with the victim, stay away, as well as some other provisions that can be in place to give effect to it. But if there is a violation of a currently existing interpersonal protective order or domestic violence order, you can enforce that in one of two ways. You can't do both. You can only do one or the other. If you go through family court, the court that would have issued that protective order, you can have that person held in contempt for violating it, and it's up to that person to prove to the court that there was no cause, that they didn't violate it. If you do not want to do that, the Commonwealth attorney will make a determination about whether or not a charge should be brought, but there is an independent criminal charge that can be brought for violating a Kentucky interpersonal protective order. So in your circumstance, if somebody had violated that protective order, they could be charged independently with a crime. And I do want to take a minute just to say, because I'm a circuit court judge, none of this should be taken as legal advice for anyone in any specific circumstance. I'm not allowed to give legal advice. None of this should be construed as that. I'm just happy to explain the process legally about how things can go through the court system, or maybe some legal definitions, but none of this should be construed or taken as legal advice for any particular person in any particular circumstance.
Thank you so much for sharing. What are some of the most significant challenges you face when handling domestic violence cases?
The tricky part that you face is much more than anything is the unfortunate cycle of individuals who are able to either contact the police, make a report about domestic violence, and then as time goes by, they then, for whatever reason, oftentimes involving a lack of resources, oftentimes involving somebody getting to them, they will attempt to either take back their story or ask for leniency for the perpetrator of domestic violence. And that's the hardest part, because if the facts have been proven, or at least there's a reasonable basis to believe those facts, you can know that something did in fact happen, and then you're stuck in a position. First, the prosecutor has to decide this, then I have to decide whether or not to accept it based on the prosecutor's recommendation about whether or not the case should be either amended down to a lesser charge or to be dismissed altogether if the victim in the case doesn't wish that case to go forward. And that's the hardest part, because something has happened, but the person who would be seeking the protection and who needs the protection for whatever reason that are very complex, complicated, and understandable, sometimes says, I don't want you to proceed with that. And that's the hardest part from my perspective. That's obviously not the hardest part of the whole situation. The hardest part is the victim and what they've encountered.
Absolutely.
But in terms of the decisions that I have to make and how to handle it, that's the trickiest part, because you want to protect the person, but if they're coming forward and saying, I don't want anything to happen to the individual who committed this act, it's a real fine line to have to draw about what's the proper course of action.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Mm-hmm. It is time for the safety tip of the day, brought to you by our Paducah Police Department, our very own Community Engagement Officer, Officer Blake Quinn.
Officer Quinn here from the Paducah Police Department, bringing you our safety tip of the day. Planning a safe refuge. There may come a moment when you need a safe place, either when situations escalate or when you find the right chance to leave. Always have a plan in mind. Emergency shelters. Places like the Merriman House are designed to provide refuge. Remember, it's a good idea to reach out to an advocate in advance. And for those worried about their pets, many shelters can assist, either housing them or arranging free temporary boarding. Trustworthy contacts. If there's a friend or family member the abused isn't familiar with, or if they live at a distance that provides safety, consider heading there. Do remember, if you're taking children, be informed about state custody laws, especially if crossing state boundaries. Anonymous stays. Hotels or apartments can be an option. Paying in cash reduces traceability, ensuring your location remains confidential. Here's a pro tip. Tracking isn't just in movies. Your cell phone can be a beacon to your location. Consider using a temporary pay-as-you-go phone, deactivating location services, or if necessary, leaving your primary phone behind. That wraps up today's safety tip, brought to you by the Paducah Police Department.
That was the safety tip of the day, brought to you by the Paducah Police Department, our very own Community Engagement Officer, Officer Blake Quinn. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
So before we took a break, you were talking about the unfortunate situations where domestic violence victims sometimes pull back from those legal decisions that need to be made. Talk more about that.
Well, what I would say about that is, if you have the courage to make the initial report and you find yourself either just leaving in the first place or making a plan of action and being able to escape a situation of legitimate domestic violence, or you make a report to police and they come out, if it happens, stay with it. I understand there are complex reasons that sometimes people want to go back, either because they want to preserve a marriage or a family, or they worry about kids, or they don't have financial resources. Sometimes the perpetrators, people associated with them, either friends or family, might encourage you to do stuff. Sometimes even your own family might encourage you to do stuff. But if you have the courage to try and get out of that cycle, and you can make a report, stay with it. I'm not suggesting that's an easy decision or certainly an easy circumstance. It's not, but it doesn't get any easier if you don't hold true to the original report that you made. Again, assuming that it's truthful, assuming that it's accurate. But if it is, and you can get out of that, I mean, that's the prime opportunity to be able to break a cycle and get out of a situation. Oftentimes, the very hardest thing is just leaving in the first place or making the report in the first place, because so often individuals who will perpetrate domestic violence will try and isolate the victim from friends and family. They will try and cut them off from resources, either financial or any associations in the community. There's a lot of stuff more than just an act of physical violence itself that really makes it difficult intentionally on the part of the perpetrator to make a report or get out of that situation. So if you've finally gotten to the point, no matter how long it's taken, and you are able to make that report and you're able to get out of that situation, probably the best thing you can do, again, assuming that it's a truthful and accurate report that you're making, is stay with it. And then, as you probably noted, maybe in the safety tip or in your contact with the Paducah Police Department, they have resources they can offer you. There are local community resources that can provide assistance to victims of domestic violence. There are other community partners that can help people out. So I would never want somebody to feel like I shouldn't say anything because I don't have any help, I don't have any resources, nothing would come of it, and there's nothing would come of it, because that's not true. There's a lot of people here locally, both institutionally through the police department and other agencies of law enforcement, and then also with community resources that are available that want to help you, that are available to help you, that want to help you get out of a circumstance like that. So if you make that report, and again, if it's truthful and accurate, then stick with it, and they can point you to those resources and hopefully get you out of that situation.
Thank you so much for sharing that. How does the court system support victims of domestic violence during legal proceedings?
Okay, well, again, when it comes up in circuit court, the cases are prosecuted by the Commonwealth Attorney's Office. Those are the prosecutors that handle felony criminal cases. And they have in their office an individual that's called the victim's advocate. And the victim's advocate is a role in that office where they are to provide information not only about the case and what's going on in the stages of the case, prepare witnesses for discussion, and let the victim know what's going on in terms of the case's progress, but then also to point them to resources that may be available in the community, like the ones that I just discussed a moment ago. And so don't feel like you wouldn't have any support or resources in the Commonwealth Attorney's Office. They have an individual who specifically exists to provide resources to victims of crime as those cases proceed, and then even afterwards.
Awesome. What measures are in place to ensure accountability for perpetrators of domestic violence?
Okay. Well, whatever happens, assuming there is a conviction, assuming again, and I'd speak about this in the context of criminal convictions, because that's the one where it comes up in circuit court, but assuming there is a conviction for a domestic violence related crime, whether the person is required to serve some time in jail or whether they are probated under specific circumstances, no one is ever just cut loose and set free. There will be conditions they have to meet in terms of probation and parole conditions. Again, almost invariably, there would be a no contact communication with the victim. And all of these things are enforceable orders of the court that can be brought to the court's attention if they're violated by law enforcement or the victim themselves of the crime. And so that's the main way that there's accountability for those who perpetrate acts of domestic violence. Again, invariably, there'd be a recommendation for anger management counseling and other services to help hopefully prevent any future acts of that kind. If there's a need for substance abuse treatment, because oftentimes domestic violence and substance abuse are intertwined as well, those resources are available and mandated by probation and parole for people that are out even after you've served a sentence. If you had to serve some time, whether you're paroled or probated, that'd be a condition of it as well, almost certainly.
Thank you so much. It is time for our highlighted segment called Making Empowered Choices, brought to you by Janey Wells, psychology instructor here at WKCTC.
Hi, my name is Janey Wells. I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor and assistant professor of psychology at West Kentucky Community and Technical College. Today, I'll be talking about some information about domestic violence. The information came from these books, Why Does He Do That? By Lundy Bancroft, and Should I Stay or Should I Go? By the same author. This first segment is about myths related to abuse. Abusers will give many reasons for his behavior. These reasons are excuses. There's nothing wrong with you, the person who is abused. The abuser is the one who needs to change his distorted thinking. Some excuses you might hear from an abuser include, he was abused as a child. Research shows this is not a reliable predictor of abusiveness. A bad childhood doesn't cause a man to become an abuser. If he had a bad childhood and he uses that as an excuse to say the same rather than a reason to change, it is just that, an excuse. He might also say his previous partner hurt him. If it is an excuse for mistreating you, it is a distortion of the truth. And often he will lie about previous partners whom he probably abused as well. You might also hear he abuses those he loves the most. Feelings do not cause abusive behavior. Attitudes and habits determine behavior. He might also say something like he holds in his feelings too much. Typically, abusers are overly focused on their own feelings and not focused enough on their partner's feelings, as if their inner world is the only thing that matters. Another thing you might hear from an abuser is he has an aggressive personality. Abusers can be calm and reasonable when they want and can flip like a switch. You might also hear him say he loses control. He doesn't lose control. He knows exactly what he's doing. If he says he is too angry, this shows attitudes of ownership, entitlement, and control. Those attitudes produce the anger, not the other way around. He might also tell you he is mentally ill. Remember, their value system is unhealthy, not their psychology. The research shows that even in violent abusers, the rate of mental illness is not high. Mental illness doesn't cause abusiveness. Sometimes psychiatric problems can interact with abusiveness to increase volatility, though. He might also say he hates women. Disrespect for women is rampant, but they don't hate women. The research shows that men who have abusive mothers do not develop negative attitudes toward females, but men who have abusive fathers do. Some other myths or excuses include he's afraid of intimacy and abandonment, he has low self-esteem, he has poor communication skills or conflict resolution skills. His abusiveness is as bad for him as his partner. This is not true. His attitudes keep him in the position of control where he wants to be. He might also say his addiction leads him to abuse. Addiction is not the cause of the abuse. The attitudes of entitlement, control, and ownership lead to abuse. Sometimes substances reduce inhibition, though, and gives him something to blame his behavior on.
That was our highlighted segment called Making Empowered Choices, brought to you by Janey Wells, psychology instructor at WKCTC. All right, welcome back to the show.
Sure, glad to be here.
We have a few more questions for you today, and we appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us.
Happy to.
What strategies do you believe are most effective in preventing domestic violence?
Well, ideally, if you could avoid getting into a relationship that involved domestic violence in the first place, is the easiest thing you can do. But oftentimes, those red flags and indications that might be a reality aren't there until you're already well into a relationship. Short of that, just to the extent that it's possible, simply don't stay. And I know that's easier said than done. But there's no circumstance where anybody should have to live like that. And there's nothing that you own in terms of your physical possessions that's worth suffering domestic violence for. There's no amount of money that's worth suffering domestic violence for. It's just not worth staying. There are all kinds of obstacles. Questions about what to do with kids if we have kids. What do we do in circumstances like that? But to the extent that you can avoid allowing yourself to be isolated from friends and family, that's a good one. To the extent that you can always have access to financial resources, that gives you some liberty and some ability to escape a circumstance, whereas you might not otherwise feel like you have that if you don't have any independent financial resources. And again, just maintain relationships. And then if you are in a circumstance where you're suffering domestic violence and you're able to get out of it, just stay out of it. Perpetrators are really, really good, traditionally in my experience from my practice time, in in being contrite and trying to get people back in, and they get you back in, and it's nice for a while, and then it devolves back to potentially what it was before, and this time it's a little harder to get out, maybe. One, because your family members and friends that could have supported you the first time may, not be as eager to do so if you just tumble right back into it. And again, I'm not criticizing anyone or critiquing that choice. It's very complex and not anything like as cut and dry as people might obviously think it would be. So if you can get out, don't get in the first place if you can, and then if you can get out, stay out. There's just nothing that's shown that's worth living like that. Stuff can be replaced, but you can't. So that's the best advice I can give you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. And so with my book, Leave Alive, I wrote it as a guide to help domestic violence victims. And one of the chapters in this book is identifying, toxic relationships or traits. As you mentioned, like once you're able to identify those traits, then you can stay away from those relationships. So I would advise just anyone that's watching this segment to read up on narcissism and different traits of abusers and red flags and signs to look for.
Okay.
All right. So where do you see the future of domestic violence legislation heading in your jurisdiction?
Okay. Well, here just a few years ago, the legislature expanded the definition of who's eligible to apply for an interpersonal protective order. It used to be somewhat narrowly tailored, and they've expanded the definition of who can apply for that protection. So that part of it is essentially taken care of. It's much more broad than it used to be, which is good because now it catches many more relationships than it otherwise would have. And again, that doesn't mean that it's guaranteed that an order will be entered, but you at least have the eligibility to apply for one. And so that took care of a substantial shortcoming in domestic violence protection the victims sometimes faced. There is now the ability more easily to extend a domestic violence order that's already in place if it's about to expire, and you can apply for the court to that. Again, no guarantee that you're gonna get it, but certainly you have the right and ability to ask for that. And then in terms of violent crime in general, not just related to domestic violence related crimes, the legislature certainly in the last session took a much more strident and hard turn against violent crime. And so I wouldn't be surprised. Well, I know for a fact some violent crimes that are domestic violence related received increased penalties and punishments as a result of the work of the legislature here in the last session. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that trend continue. Here in Kentucky, I think there is certainly a decreased tolerance for violent crimes of any kind, and
Absolutely.
the legislature has reflected that in the most recent session, in an effort to try and protect citizens from instances of violent crime.
Thank you so much for sharing. Judge Joe Rourk, it has been a great pleasure having you on Voices of Victory. Thank you so much for taking the time again to be my guest today.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
All right. Allow me to share with you the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Call 1-800-799-SAFE. That's 1-800-799-7233. Or text the word BEGIN, BEGIN, to 88788. Remember, you are not alone, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made. I've been your host, and my name is Danette Mahabeer-Turner, and I will see you on the next episode.